Hello. All right, so now we're going to actually get into the meat of theology of the body. And so everything we've sort of talked about up to this point, now we're going to get into what John Paul II was trying to do. So hopefully we have enough foundation now that we're going to understand what he's doing. We've got enough sort of vocabulary. We sort of get in his mindset where we kind of understand what he's trying to do. He's trying to take like objective reality and talk about subjective experience of objective reality and what that actually tells us about ourselves, right? So throughout the rest of the time, like we did when we did Love and Responsibility, there's a lot of times when you go, yeah, I know what that feels like, or I know what that's like. And that's his goal. So he's trying to sort of get us to say, well, you know, what does this sort of universal experience tell us about ourselves? And then how do we sort of use that to grow in self-knowledge and self-awareness? All right. So that's sort of what we're going to do. And so he starts at the beginning. So what he does, it's pretty amazing, actually. So there's 129 different addresses that he uses during his Wednesday audience. Some of this, I think we talked about, was written before he was Pope, some of it after. And what he does is he basically takes 3 words of Christ, 3 words from Scripture is what he calls a triptych. And that's the whole basis of the theology of the body. All right, and so the words he starts with are from last week's gospel. Had we been here last week, it would have been rather providential. But he's talking about the question of marriage. And so he, rather than Mark's version, which we heard last week, he goes to Matthew's version. So some Pharisees approached Jesus and tested him, saying, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any cause whatever?" He said in reply, "Have you not read that from the beginning," and that from the beginning is really important, "the Creator made them male and female, and said, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two but one flesh. Therefore what God has joined together no human being must separate." They said to him, "Then why did Moses command that the man give the woman a bill of divorce and dismiss her?" He said to them, "Because of the hardness of your hearts, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so." And so what John Paul II is saying is, well, if you really want to know about, first of all, about marriage, then go back to the beginning. Right? Go back to God's original plan for it. But meanwhile, while you do that, he also mentions that Moses gave a concession because of your hardness of heart. And so Jesus is sort of incorporating our fallen state and how everything's sort of blurred, and how we can go back to the beginning so that we can know what God's original plan was, and so that we sort of grasp what Christ is redeeming us to do and become. Okay? So he's saying, yeah, because the Israelites didn't have me, and because of their hardness of heart, Moses had to make all these concessions. But just like when he says, you know, Moses said this, but I say, so what Christ is inviting us to and then empowering us to is something much fuller and much deeper. Okay? So that we don't have to live in that muck of our fallen nature. All right? So what he's trying to do, just as all these sort of these arguments with the Pharisees, they're always very, very worried about the juridical part of it, right? Like, okay, the law says this, what do you say? And Jesus is like, well, let's not do that. Let's not get into these juridical arguments. Let's sort of, let's see if we can go back to the beginning, because what I'm offering you is so much more than following just a simple bunch of laws, okay? All right, so you can see, too, the other thing that in this particular verse with Christ, he's mixing the 2 creation accounts, right? So when he talks about, when he says, you know, the Creator made the male and female, that's from the first creation account. And then he talks about, you know, for this reason a man shall leave his father. He's pulling something from the second creation account. So what he's doing is inviting him to go back to both and sort of read and begin to meditate on man's creation. All right. And remember, we talked about how John Paul II is really big about sort of looking at things objectively and then trying to give a subjective account of them, or sort of a psychological explanation of them. And the reason why he does this, we'll see, is precisely because he says Christ does it, by mixing these 2 creation accounts. Okay, so just a little like biblical sort of understanding of the two creation accounts. You'll remember they seem to, at least on the surface level, be very different, right? In the first creation account, there's 7 days, and God creates on each of the days, and it sort of gives this sort of step-by-step process, right? But the second creation account, which starts in Genesis chapter 2, it starts with man, right? And so, and then it begins to talk about man's experience, all right? So what John Paul II says is this first account, which is actually, like historically, the one that's written later. The biblical scholars call it the Elohist, or the Elohim, which is a name for God. It's the name that account uses. You see how it sort of progresses, right, to man, and puts man as the crown of creation, right, where he is objectively the crown of creation. And it especially says, okay, well, what is man in relation to everything else, including in relation to God, right? So he says, man is made in the image, and let us make man in the image and likeness of God. And so John Paul II, in quoting, he says, in the 7-day cycle of creation, a precise graduated procedure is evident, talking about that gradation. However, man is not created according to a natural succession. The Creator seems to halt before calling him into existence, as if he were pondering within himself to make a decision. He says, let us make man in our image after our likeness. So if you read it very carefully, you'll notice like throughout he goes, let there be, let there be, let there be. And then he says, he almost stops for a second and goes, let us make man. And notice these sort of Trinitarian hints in there when he says, let us make man in our image and after our likeness. Okay, so what this sort of objective account is just basically says, okay, what is man? Okay, and it gives it, again, in relation to everything else. All right, and then what John Paul II says is, okay, well, that's the first account. The second account sort of tells us who man is. Okay, so we've got what man is in the first account, and then who man is in the second. And remember, that's really what John Paul II is trying to do with Theology about it, right? Tell us who we are, develop what we talked about was an adequate anthropology, what he calls an adequate anthropology. And then in the end, he's going to say, okay, now that you know who you really are, now do what you were made for. All right? So he then splits these two into saying, okay, well, this second way really focuses on man's subjective experience. All right? And so he says, okay, what is it like? What is his experience as a person? And then psychologically, how does that help to sort of understand our experiences? Okay, and then you'll notice as well that this is the sort of the older account, and he says he calls it the Yahwist account. Okay, because God's name is Yahweh in this account. All right. So here's what he says. He says it can be said that it is profundity that is of a nature particularly subjective. Okay, so it's just a subjective account, and therefore, in a certain sense, psychological. The second chapter of Genesis constitutes, in a certain manner, the most ancient description and record of man's self-knowledge. Together with the third chapter, it is the first testimony of human conscience. All right, and so we'll sort of spend a little bit of time just unpacking that, especially the part about self-knowledge. All right, so what John Paul II does is he breaks down the experiences into three different experiences, what he calls original solitude, original unity, and original nakedness. All right, and we're gonna talk about each one of those, and again to sort of help us to understand God's plan from the beginning. So, his original solitude. Okay, in Genesis, the affirmation of God Yahweh, "It is not good that man should be alone," appears not only in the immediate context of the decision to create woman, "I will make him a helper fit for him," but also in the wider context of reasons and circumstances which explain more deeply the meaning of man's original solitude. The Yahweh text connects the creation of man first and foremost with the need to till the ground. All right, so what is he saying when he's saying that, when he talks about original solitude? So what's the first thing that Adam does? Does anyone remember? Yes, Phil.
He names the animals.
Yeah. So, in naming them, what we've talked about this before. In naming them, what does that suggest to us?
He has power over them.
He has power over them, certainly. And what is the other thing? So, if I have someone's name, it gives me a power over them, but what does it also mean?
Like, there's a connection there. Like, I'm not just any person.
I know them, right?
Yeah.
Like to name something means I know what it is. Right? If I see something, my first question is, what is that? And you might tell me the name of it, and that's important, right? Because I now can call that thing up, to your point about the power, but also just it says I know what it is. All right. So Adam, in knowing the animals and naming the animals, is essentially saying that he knows what each one of them are. Okay. Why is that important? Why does it matter that he knows what each one of the animals are?
Because, like, when he's, like, since he knows all the animals, he knows that none of them are, like, a suitable companion. Like, none of them fit that need.
Okay, yeah, he's certainly jumping ahead a little bit, but yeah. So he knows that he's different from all of them, right? And so there's this idea then, for self-knowledge, we have to have something other than ourselves, right? And this, again, is that sort of that Cartesian trap that we talked about last time about, I think, therefore I am. When we get stuck in our own heads, when there's nothing to in which we're related to, we don't know what we are, right? So only in knowing something that's not me can I know me, right? So just as much as knowing what something isn't, it allows me to know what something is, all right? And so what John Paul II, his point of this is saying, okay, in doing this, in going through and naming the animals, he realizes that he's different from them, but he's also learning something about himself. Okay, and so you see remember we talked about what makes us distinctly human, right? Is this power of self-knowledge, or knowledge in general, and this power of will, or self-determination, okay? And we're going to see how both of these are present. Self-knowledge develops at the same rate as knowledge of the world, of all the visible creatures, of all the living beings to which man has given a name to affirm his own dissimilarity with regards to them. In this way, consciousness reveals man as the one who possesses a cognitive faculty as regards the visible world. With this knowledge, which in a certain way brings him out of his own being, man at the same time reveals himself to himself in all the peculiarity of his being. All right. So, again, we talked about how thick the language of theology of the body is. Does that last paragraph make sense after what I said? Okay, so that's what part of what we want to do is we want to sort of be able to look at these, maybe not pick up the whole thing and read it, but to go, okay, I know what that means now. And that's sort of the point. That's why I gave you the quotes. If it's not helpful, tell me. We won't do it that way. I don't need to read out long quotes. I just sort of want to arm you guys to be able to read them yourselves.
Definitely.
All right, so
Easier than reading it. I've tried reading the beginning of this, and it just hurts.
Yeah, I mean, it's he's a poet and a philosopher, which is like the absolute worst combination ever. And really, really much smarter than any of us probably combined, which is even probably the third strike against him. So being able to unpack this and sort of understand what he's saying, I think helps a lot, because some of it is when you. He's really kind of appealing to like common sense and like asking questions that we just sort of take for granted, right? Like, not all of us like get in the shower and look at ourselves and ponder, why am I made like this? But he's doing that, right? He's like saying, well, why are you made like this? Because it can help tell us something about ourselves, right? So here's now the question, okay? This is what I want to sort of launch us with. Hopefully you're not really getting in the shower and contemplating yourself, but
Look in the mirror and just say, why am I made like this?
I guess the emphasis really matters, right? On where the emphasis is. Why? How did Adam know he was different from the animals? Yes.
He can see himself.
Okay, yeah. So he can certainly see himself, but this is an important question for what the world says about what man is.
He's the only creature made in the likeness of God.
Okay, but so could Adam see that, you think? Go ahead, Sarah.
I guess like his communication with God, I'm sure it was different than the animals' communication with God.
Yeah, that's part of it, but think of it more just try not to read into the text too much of just know he's looking at the animals and he's like, nope. Like, but he kind of looks like an animal, right?
It's like, they got tails, but I don't.
Yeah.
I mean, he's thinking at all.
I tried to give him a thumbs up, he wouldn't do it. Like, Opposable thumbs. Really, you guys are a little.
Interrupted.
Only man can give. I think John Paul II actually says only man can give a thumbs up.
Oh, okay.
That's not, he doesn't say. Doesn't matter. Don't argue with me.
Anyway, the sentence I was going to say was, like, the fact that he was able to ask that question at all.
Yeah.
Like,
well,
you can kind of tell from observing something whether or not it knows and or cares that you exist.
yeah.
You can't really get that from most animals.
Okay. Now think about where we're going. Like the title of this thing, Lizzie. What were you going to say?
I was going to say that we are given like intellectual thoughts and moral reasonings.
Yeah. So if he tried to hold a conversation with one of them, they might go, just kind of give him the dumb stare.
If you're talking about this title of the slide, then he's
Well,
alone.
Yeah, he's alone. So original solitude, but he's alone, and he knows this
Because everything else isn't.
because something about his body is different than their bodies. Okay, this is really important for us to grasp this, right? Because this is why it's called theology of the body, right? Like, remember we talked about, it's a really strange name, right? Theology of the body, like God doesn't have a body. What? Theology of the body, study of God of the body. And so Adam, in and through his body, knows he's different, right? He looks at himself, of all he can see. He can't see his soul. He really can't, can't say for sure that, that maybe their intellect is so much higher than his that they can't even communicate with him. But what is it that makes Adam go, no, like I'm not a monkey. I'm not a trousered ape. I'm not, like all these, like, why doesn't he say that? What is it about himself that makes him say that, okay? And obviously we're not going to necessarily answer that question right now, but that's the point, right? Like to go, what is it really that makes man fundamentally different? And yeah, intellectual thought, the ability to love makes us different. But there's something even bodily about the difference, okay? Because the body reveals the person, right? And that's really important for us to grasp in a sort of materialistic, Gnostic, dualistic culture that we live in, okay? All right, so we said the other part was, so we have his original solitude where he begins to go, okay, I'm not like them, and he gets this idea sort of that he's alone. Right? And so now we're gonna see, well, where's his power of self-determination? Okay. Remember when we talked about, just to sort of again give us a vocabulary of self-determination. All right. You can be anything you want to be. All right. Not in the sense of like how people will try to give you self-esteem and say, oh, whatever you set your mind to, you can. But our decisions make us into something. Okay, so we have this power to become a certain kind of person. That's what it means by self-determination. Okay, so I can become a virtuous person. I can become a vicious person. I can become a holy person. I can become a scoundrel. I have the power to do all of those things. Okay, so when we talk about self-determination, that's what it means. All right. Okay, so John Paul II wants to sort of complete this sketch. All right, so we already talked about man having this power of knowledge, especially self-knowledge. And then let's talk about this power that he has to determine himself. In the second narrative, he is manifested as a subject of the covenant. That is, a subject constituted as a person, constituted in a dimension of partner of the absolute. Okay, so we begin to see something about relationship here. He must consciously discern and choose between good and evil, between life and death. All right, so what John Paul II is saying, okay, when God says to him, don't eat from the tree. Okay. So he's already sort of distinguished between what is good for you, what is not. And he then leaves it to Adam to say, what do you want to be? Which one do you want to be? All right? And this is the sort of perennial question for all of us, right? Because it's not just that we do bad. Somehow the actions that we do in and through our body redound to our very person, and we become that thing. All right? And I know we've talked about before, if I continually lie, I become a liar. I steal, I become a thief. So all these things. So he puts this before Adam and says, what will you be? All right. The words of the first order of God, Yahweh, in Genesis 2, chapter 2, verses 16 and 17, speak directly of the submission and dependence of man, the creature, on his creator. They indirectly reveal precisely this level of humanity as a subject of the covenant and partner of the absolute. Man is alone. That means that he, through his own humanity, through what he is constituted at the same time in a unique, exclusive, and unrepeatable relationship with God himself. All right, so somebody already said this, that in a lot of ways, Adam comes to realize that he's different from the animals in his ability to have a relationship with God. Okay? But then I asked you again the question of, well, how does he know that? How does he know that, one, that he can do that, and that the others don't do it? Okay? And that's the sort of thing, because again, he's sufficiently not that different from the animals in his body, but there's something in his awareness that makes him different. Okay? All right. So now Adam begins to experience. Okay, so let me just make a point. I don't think I made this on any of the slides, so I just want to bring it up real quick. So John Paul II says that, and I think he's right. So when you hear, like, I think this goes without saying that like the Bible shouldn't fall prey to like inclusive language. Like when the creation account speaks of man, it means man and woman. Okay, in fact, it uses a different word. So it's not really saying that, like, chronologically, that Adam's doing this all by himself. What he's saying is this is the journey of men and women, period, right? So they grasp this self-knowledge and self-determination, and then something happens. So he says, don't read this like, okay, Adam had to go through these steps before Eve could be created. Okay? But what he's saying is that man or woman had to go through these steps before they became conscious of the other. Okay? And we'll see why this makes sense in just a minute. All right? So when he says man, he tends, especially John Paul II, will tend to, when he's speaking of like man as an Adam, he'll say Adam. But when he just means man and woman, he'll usually just say man. Okay? Listening to the words of God, Yahweh, man should have understood that the tree of knowledge had roots not only in the Garden of Eden, but also in his humanity. He should have understood furthermore that the mysterious tree concealed within it a dimension of loneliness, hitherto unknown, with which the Creator had endowed him in the midst of the world of living beings, to which he, man, in the presence of the Creator himself, had given names in order to understand that none of them was similar to him. All right? How does Adam understand when God says, if you eat it, you will die? How does he understand death? Like, what do you think? Yes.
Was there death before then?
I don't know. What do you guys think? So, in our natural state, right, we are spirit and body. Naturally, anything material passes away, right? So God gives Adam the gift, we call it a preternatural gift of not dying. So, in general, man is made to die, okay? Now God can preserve that. So how would Adam have understood death, though? Because remember, what happens, he says, you will die, and then the serpent says, you won't die, and then Adam eats of the tree, and he doesn't die.
Right, so he's probably thinking about the physical sense, like what he's seen other creatures do when they die, or something. Not thinking about it on the level of falling from grace, certainly, because he doesn't realize that's happened until it's happened.
Yeah. Yes.
This is going to be a dumb question, but like, did humans die before the fall?
I think it's hard to go to say before, put it in time the way we would have. I mean, they certainly could have. I mean, it wasn't as if they were somehow preserved. And certainly, I mean, I don't see why not.
Because he must have a concept of at least death in some form for that question.
Yeah, so it's not a meaningless thing that God's saying, hey, and it's enough that he fears it.
You really can't fear something if you don't know it.
Yeah. So let's sort of back up just a second. So when the world looks at something like the hurricane, right? And they're like, how could a loving God do that? They're sort of assuming something about this, about death. What are they assuming? Yes, Ken?
Well, they're assuming that that's sort of the end. They
Exactly.
think love means kindness. Like kindness is the prevention of suffering, but love is willing the good of the other, and they're different in that case because God can still allow that to happen and be loving them because they can still go to heaven and die.
Yeah. So the takeaway is death is not the worst thing that can happen to you, right? That's what he wants him to know, like, because in a lot of ways, and we'll talk about this more next time when we meet about the fall. Like the serpent's sort of comment about dying is really it's a veiled threat, right? Like, you won't die, but if you don't eat it, I'm going to kill you, right? So this sort of idea of like death being the worst thing that can happen, right? And that's where we get, right? But what this is really leading us towards is sort of understanding that the worst thing that can happen, death, is eternal separation from God. Okay? And so Adam doesn't know what that's like, right? That's not in his experience. And so God has to tell him that. And so that's what he means by that, right? And he will then experience like true loneliness, right? He's truly lonely because the one he was made for, he no longer has a connection to. All right, does that make sense? Because it's sort of important for us to understand like the difference between like death and immortality. All right. Okay, so this thing is looming, right? This perpetual loneliness is always looming over man. Okay. All right. So now let's sort of look at the creation of woman, and now we'll sort of be able to tie it together. John Paul II says, the words of Genesis 2:23 speak of it directly and for the first time in the following terms: flesh of my flesh and bone of my bones. And see here, now he's starting to make the distinction. The male, as I'm saying that, I'm like, hey, wait a second. That's like a guy's worst nightmare. His wife's having an affair with the male man. Uttered these words as if it were only at the sight of the woman that he was able to identify and call by name what makes them visibly similar to each other, and at the same time what manifests humanity. In the light of the preceding analysis of all the bodies which man has come into contact with, and which he has defined conceptually, giving them their name, animalia, the expression, flesh of my flesh, takes on precisely this meaning. The body reveals man. All right, so now, okay, Eve is created, all right, and he looks at her, sees her body, and her body is maybe something like his, but not really, something profoundly different. But he knows it's different from the bodies of all the other animals. Okay, and so what John Paul II says is, well, it's the body that reveals the person. Okay, so what does that mean, though? Like, in this case, like, what is Adam seeing in her that leads him to conclude that?
Like, do you mean in a metaphorical sense or like in a literal sense?
Yeah, I mean, either one. I mean, it's both.
Then we talk about like your guardian angel can like be here, but you don't see them, you know. Whereas like I can't just like people can't actually put on an invisibility cloak and just like.
Yeah, so
like,
certainly
they're like, oh, that person is like there in space and time.
Yeah, the presence part is certainly part of it, right? But why does he conclude that? Why does he know that one was made for him?
Because it looks the same. Well, like similar enough.
Okay.
Close enough.
Dude, I've been lonely. Like, it's close enough. Yes, Sarah.
I guess, like, is it something that, like, he might not have been able to explain, but it was just, like, he had an understanding of who she was as a person through her physical form, which was not something that he'd experienced.
Okay, so what you just said is really, like, say that again about he saw the person through her physical form. That's really important. But what about yes, Nicole?
He saw her complementarity.
Yeah, certainly complementarity is part of it. But what are they both imaging? God, right? Like, he sees her and he's like, oh, all those other animals, they're not in the image and likeness of God. I look at her and she's made in the image and likeness of God. And it's radiating out of her. All right? That part is really important, okay? just that he sees it in and through the body. How many of you guys have been around like a really holy person? Do you get that feeling like you're like, oh, like this is what I was made for, right? That's his experience. He looks at her, so it's not as if he's just like sort of just drawn to her because they have, their plumbing is complementary to each other. It's more than that, right? He's like, oh, and then he looks at the body and goes, I'm made for relationship. Okay, so that part of it that we immediately think like is important, but it's almost like second nature. Okay. Yes. Phil.
Does that go back to like love and responsibility of the whole thing, like subject?
Yeah, he sees that object as a subject. He sees that it's a person. Exactly. Okay. So he sees her, and that's why he's really like wow, and he goes this one. All right. And then we'll touch this in a second about why it's important to not think in terms of like them all alone, as if, well, it just has to be that way because of the last two people on Earth. Or the first two people on Earth, I guess, would be more accurate. But why he chooses her as a subject, which we'll talk about in a second. Okay, so let's talk about this for just a second, about the idea of Eve being made from Adam. God created man and woman together, this is from the Catechism, together and willed each for the other. The Word of God gives us to understand this through various features of the sacred text. It is not good for that the man should be alone. I will make him a helper fit for him. None of the animals can be man's partner. The woman God fashions from the man's rib and brings to him elicits on the man's part a cry of wonder, an exclamation of love and communion. This, at last, is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. Man discovers woman as another I, sharing the same humanity. Okay, so I want to talk about sort of the interpretation of this, okay? Does Eve have to be, do we have to believe that Eve came from the rib of Adam?
No.
Why not?
Because, like, it could be, like poetry in the sense of, like, it's imagery from the same substance.
Okay, so you're saying it doesn't necessarily have to be from the rib, but you're saying that she did come from him.
No.
Okay.
like the rib could be like imagery for like the same substance, like they're the same kind.
Okay. What do you guys think?
We don't have to believe that the creation story is literal, so we don't have to believe that they're from the exact same, like that's what happened to the T scientifically. Like, I was like, let's take this rib and just make it happen.
Yeah, that's kind of the same line of thought.
That they are the same species, kind of.
Okay, well, so I'll let the cat out of the bag a little bit. So the church does say that we have to believe that Eve came from Adam. Okay?
And that they both were real people.
Yeah, and that they were both real people.
Yeah.
That she came from his rib. Let's talk about that for a second. So, a lot of times we'll say, well, that's just symbolic language, and it may very well be. But we forget that, wait a second, God doesn't need to use, like, if he wants to use a symbol, he'll just use the symbol, right? So he can really take her from the rib of Adam and fashion her up. I mean, if he's going to say he did it that way, why not go ahead and do it that way? Like, it's not like as if, he's like Shakespeare trying to use like all these like hidden meanings of things. No, if God gets to use a symbol because he can do that. So there's no reason not to believe that she even came from his rib. Okay? And what John Paul II wants us to see is, well, the rib actually tells us something. Okay? So if we start with the premise of that Eve did come from Adam, which we'll talk about why that's at least reasonable in a second. We obviously can't prove it. Why would it need to be the rib? Why not the foot?
So I think this is either Jason Everett or Mike Schmitz or Chris Stefanik, all awesome people. But it's probably Jason Everett. But he said, like, he has this really long, well-worded thing, but it's like he took him from her side because they're partners, like they stand side by side. If she took him from his head, then she could lord it over him because she's from the top part of him. From his feet, he could walk all over, but it's from his side.
Yeah. So there's this sort of equality between the two. In pulling out the rib, remember we talked about, I know we talked about this a while ago, that we try to view everything through the lens of Christ, right? What happened when Christ's rib was opened? Yeah, and the birth of his bride, right? Okay, so now we begin to see, well, wait a second, maybe this is actually the way we should interpret this, because it now takes meaning in Christ, full meaning in Christ, right?
Makes me upset.
But think about, too, and this goes with what Adam says, right? When his rib is taken out, what's exposed?
His heart.
His heart, right? His heart. And then all of a sudden, he's like, his heart now, of all these things he was looking to love, he couldn't find any. Now his heart is wide open. Okay,
That makes so much more sense.
Yeah, so there's no reason to not think, okay, this is legitimate.
What a freaking hell.
Because it's the way, like, again, speak to your own experience, right? Like, that's what it feels like, right? This just opening up all of a sudden, right? And it sort of makes sense, all right? Let's talk just a second about why evolution doesn't work. All right, now I said it's revealed that the church says we have to believe this. We couldn't ever necessarily reason to it, although we just did a good job of coming pretty close to reasoning to it. What's the problem with like an evolutionary view of it? What does evolution assume, first of all?
Randomness.
Yeah, there's some randomness, but it always assumes inferior, superior, right? That's one of the premises, right? And where do we want to start? Equal, right? We don't want inferior, superior, right? So there's that, first of all, where there's just this, you're never going to get to equality of persons that way. And then we have the other sort of practical problem of, well, did they evolve together? If they did, they're going to go off in different directions. They'll never be equal. All right, and so even evolutionarily speaking, is that even a word? There's problems with that. Okay, there's problems with beginning to think that way of why that can't be. Okay. Now again, there's things that, like, again, back to what you said about the creation account. There are things in there that are meant to be taken symbolically, but I don't think this is one of them. Okay. And again, this is me speaking, not necessarily the church, although the church does say that Eve came from Adam. But if we're going to make all the conclusions about equality, that's the only way it works. All right? Okay. All right, so where we sort of left off then, and this is a really long quote, so I'm just going to probably just pick out little pieces of it. Okay, so where we are now. So we talked about original solitude, right? And Adam realizes he's alone, and then now he's sort of moved towards what John Paul II calls original unity. He goes, this is bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. I was made for this, okay? So John Paul II says that original unity overcomes original solitude. Yes?
Is that the this? That he says, like, I was made for this? Is that...
Yeah, so now he realizes, okay, I was made for not just this, but for her, okay? And so the two become one. But in doing this, okay, this is really the important part too, because when we get to this is beginning to think like, well, hold on a second, that just means that like only if you're married then will you be complete, okay? And that's John Paul II doesn't want us to conclude that, all right? So in doing this, right, in getting to this point where what he calls this sort of communion of persons, what does Adam conclude? That I was made just for this person, or is it more? Yes.
I want to say more, because I mean, even just thinking about it, like, if those relationships embody, like, relationship between God, there's, like, mean, children are part of that relationship within that
Yeah.
context.
Well, remember, what did I say? He was ultimately made him say, this one. Because she had what? The image of God, right? So ultimately, then he goes, oh, that's what's sort of attracting me towards her, is the image of God. I must be made not just for relationship with her, but for relationship with God.
Okay.
Right? And the important part of this is to sort of step away and go, that's just a sign, right? His attraction to her, their one flesh union, all those things are just a sign that we were made for relationship with God. Okay? And people live out the sign. Right? And then there's people who, you can almost think of marriage as a sign of the sign. Right? And then later on we talk about celibacy for the kingdom of God. Those people are living out what it will actually look like in heaven here on earth, right? So it's sort of like the sign, and then the two sort of complement each other, and this will make way more sense when we get to that. But what I want us to conclude is that not, oh, well, I can only be fulfilled if I'm married. No, there's other ways in which that self-giving is lived out. And there's other ways in which you become a sign. This is just the sort of what he'll call the primordial way. This is the natural way that we are made to live this out. Okay? And so if we sort of sum up what we've said so far, that the body reveals the person, and that says that I'm made for communion, and not just communion with this person, but communion with God. Okay? So that's where he goes with these two, okay? And then we'll talk about how that image is in just a second. Okay. So then I said the three that he talks about are original solitude, original unity, and original nakedness. Okay? And if you guys remember when we talked about, in Love and Responsibility, we talked a lot about shame. All right? So here's what John Paul II wants us to ask. He says, when talking about that they were naked without shame, does that mean that, to begin with, they did not know that they were naked, or that they did not see the nakedness of each other's bodies? So what do you think? When they just suddenly wake up and realize they're naked, what do you think that, why do they suddenly, why does it become an issue when it wasn't an issue before? Did they just not see that? So they're just not paying attention? Or they're just really holy? They keep their eyes down? What? Yes. Sarah, go ahead.
And I think we talked about, maybe with Nick, or with another speaker who came through, that the idea that once them realizing it was, they were realizing it because they started sinning in a way, they started using each other's bodies in a way that they hadn't before.
Okay, so that is not necessarily that they're using their bodies, but there is a temptation to use the other person, right? But that's sort of like next time's discussion. Let's talk about why they appear to not realize it. Okay? Or is it just that it didn't matter to them? What?
I mean, you only describe something to describe how it's different from something else. So if you just exist like this, and then that's just how you exist. You don't need a word to describe it because there's nothing to distinguish it from yet.
So, but is it more than just like the fish who can't tell you what water is? Like, is it deeper than that? Because remember, he's trying to take the original experience and map it to our experience now.
Is this like just physical nakedness?
Yeah, I mean, it's talking about the physical nakedness of them, right? So maybe we can do it experientially. Yes, Kevin.
So, like in the original.
That really got cut off right in the middle of what I wanted to say.
Especially with an audio only.
Yeah. Still have my clothes on. Audio, no video. Still have clothes on. Yes, Kevin.
In the original state of holiness, it was all giving and receiving. Like they were only concerned about loving the other, giving to the other, and receiving what the other was giving them. But as soon as they sinned, they fell from grace. Then now they're starting to try and take from the other. So their action is trying to bring the other to themselves instead of receiving what's freely given.
Yeah. So there's this what he will call the sort of ethos of the gift. And that is certainly, that's sort of part of it, but it still gets ahead a little bit. So, okay, so if you're in the, again, using the shower analogy, you're in the shower and somebody walks into the bathroom, what is your first sort of... Exactly. Why those spots? Like, why do you cover those spots and not other ones? Like, why don't you go like this? They're not here! Like, why do you cover your, what are called privates, right? Because what you guys talk about shame. But what if your spouse walks in? You don't do that, right? Okay, I'll just tell you, you don't do that. But why? Like, why wouldn't a wife do that, or why wouldn't a husband do that?
Because they're one flesh.
Because they know that they see the person, that the body reveals the person. They're like, oh, that's just my wife taking a shower, right? And they're like, there's no threat of me being used. This person knows me. It's okay. It's safe. Okay. And so what John Paul II wants us to see is that the body reveals the person, and that it's part of being, like, that comfort level is part of being known. All right? And I deliberately use the word known because we'll get to that in a minute, okay? But that's the point. Like, it just becomes, that's the person taking a shower. That's not just, I walked in on some girl taking a shower. It's different, okay? And it's different because the person is known, all right? And so the point is that what has changed is not that they were aware of nakedness. They were aware they were naked, right? But what changed is the meaning of nakedness, right? Yes?
This might, I hope it doesn't go on what you're going to say next, because you talk about the knowing part. Just a question on that. Because visually, like on here, they passed from not knowing they were naked to knowing that they were naked. Is that going to go from knowing the person to not knowing the person?
In a certain respect, yeah. So that's a great question, actually. So in a certain respect, now there is, and we'll talk more about this next time, but there is this sort of, there's this relationship of conflict between the man and the woman, right? And where there's always, they become a little bit masters of suspicion of each other. And while, marriage is supposed to heal that, which is why, again, like, divorce is a bad thing, because what do children learn? They learn that actually men and women are always in conflict, right? Whereas if they're in a stable situation, they go, oh, no, men and women have their issues, but they were actually made to work together, okay? So it moves to this sort of, well, I can't reveal myself fully to this person because there's some law of self-preservation, whatever. It doesn't even have to be just like physically being used. It can be a lot of things, okay? So yes, it does. It reverses that. Okay. So again, we talked about, like, when we did that sort of metaphysical analysis of shame, we talked about why shame was a good thing. And now to flip that sort of, the reason they didn't feel shame, again, which we just talked about, is because there was no chance of them being used. Okay? They knew that they were going to be loved. All right? Okay. So a couple more, like, vocabulary words that'll help us, especially throughout this. John Paul II talks about, quite a bit, he talks about the spousal or nuptial meaning of the body. In fact, he says, the gift reveals, so to speak, a particular characteristic of personal existence, or rather, of the essence of the person. When God Yahweh said, it is not good that man should be alone, he affirmed that alone, man does not completely realize this essence. He realizes it only by existing with someone, even more deeply and completely by existing for someone. This norm of existence as a person is shown in Genesis as characteristic of creation, precisely by means of the meaning of these words, alone and helper. These words indicate as fundamental and constitutive for man both the relationship and the communion of persons. All right, so what is he doing? He's trying to take these two words, alone and helper, and he sort of juxtaposes them so that it tells us something about ourselves, right? So when Genesis says that Eve was made as a helper for him, what does that mean? Like, it's a little bit of an odd way to describe her, right? And people have abused that, obviously. And so, well, she's made to, if I need the laundry picked up, I'll call my helper. Yes, Felix.
So, like, I could be wrong here, but alone could be seen as like a condition that's like ill, and like a helper fixes that.
Okay. What were you going to say?
I would pick Ephesians, like to sort of go with what Paul says, where the man has a mission, and he has it alone, and then there's someone there to help him with the mission.
So the idea of submitting, submission, being under the mission of. So this is, again, if we can sort of look at this not necessarily through the lens of do you remember when we talked about Humanae Vitae the first week, we had the little thing with natural law, the 4 conditions, like the 4 things that we're sort of driven to do, and we talked about 2 of them were sort of almost sort of determining that we're not fulfilled until we get into like relationships with other people. We talked about marriage and just this need to form societies. How do we know that? Like, how do we know we're not just supposed to be rugged individuals? Which is what sort of our country is predicated on, right? That, yeah, we come together because it just makes it easier, because it's much easier to make 100 shirts than one by myself. Yes?
I think part of it's like almost natural. Like, I remember watching snippets of this, I think it was called like The Last Man in the World, some TV show, where it's like, for like episode after episode, and I would just see like flip just every week or so, like snippets of it and tally, and it was just like, this guy was alone. Like, imagine just everybody just disappeared off the face of the earth, and he was like going to the store, and everything. It was just like one of the most horrifying and just like depressing things I've seen. Like,
so using that as an example, it's a hard, like being by yourself, solitary is, but look at like the way they set that up, and I've never seen the show, I'm just going off what you described. So he's going to the grocery store by himself. Did he stop the grocery store? Or was it just because everybody else died?
No, he just like took stuff from the grocery store.
Yeah, so it's like everyone else died, so everything is now mine. But somebody else put those things there, right? Yeah. Presumably. So what does that sort of tell us?
We don't really know what it's like to be completely alone.
Yeah, I mean that somehow we would be less than what we are alone, and then in a certain sense we can't even do that. Right, so Kevin said almost natural, but what he really meant was without the almost. It's natural. Because God said is very good, very good, very good. Not good for man to be alone. Okay, meaning man has this. But again, how would we know that? Yes.
Well, if you're alone and you die, that's it. You can't keep the race going if everyone's alone.
Yeah. Go simpler. Go simpler. There's going to be an answer to this. Like, you guys are going to get sick of hearing this part, because John Paul II says it all the time. Go ahead, Colin, do you know what it is?
Probably not. But, like, just knowing, like for us, like Adam saw God within Eve, so when he's by himself, like, he can't really see God, so when you're alone. So it's easier, so he's his helper because he helps him see God and not be alone.
Yeah, I mean that's the definition of the helper, right? But it can be even simpler, right? I was kidding earlier when I said like you sit there in the shower and contemplate your body, but the truth is that the male body makes no sense without the female body, right? Like I can look at myself and go, I'm supposed to be united to someone else, right? And a woman can look at herself and go, so as John Paul II says over and over, in and through the body. Like this is what he's trying to say. He's like, how do you know this? In and through the body. Right? Like in all this time where we try to hyper-spiritualize things, he's bringing it back down to common sense and going, well, I know this because that's how I'm made. Look at me. Right? Like this gender that was assigned to me at birth. I know it. Like it's who I am. Okay? And that part is really important, right? Because think about how this, and we'll talk about this the last time we meet this semester, how this answers so many of the world's ills. Right? Where we're trying to change bodies, where we're trying to, we have a cult of the body. All these things, like almost every one of these ties back to this. And it all comes down to we forgot who we were, okay? And it starts with, I know who I am in and through my body, okay? I know that dude in the picture was me because that's me. That's my body. Okay? And so what he's trying to say is that the spousal meaning of the body tells me, spousal meaning, nuptial meaning, what he means is we were made for a gift. Okay? We were made to be a gift. All right? So we were, and this is this sort of, it's this, what he calls the hermeneutic of the gift, okay? Where we receive the gift from God and we transmit the gift. Right? Remember we talked about, I think it was last time we met, we talked about what makes us in the image of God, right? We said intellect and will, but also this capacity to cause good in other things. Right? God makes us co-creators. So Adam has this experience, most especially, not just, he isn't just like, ooh la la, like, this is great. This is like, it's finally something I pour my heart into. And that's the spousal meaning of the body. All right. Okay. Let me see if I think I already may have let the cat out of the bag on this one. Okay, so yeah, he's basically just saying what I just said. Shortest slide ever. Okay. All right. So now we're sort of he wants to drag us back a little bit, and he has this one quote, and it's from the Second Vatican Council about the meaning of life, and he uses it. I mean, it's hard to read one of his encyclicals and not see this quoted. And here's the quote directly. It says, "Indeed, the Lord Jesus, when he prayed to the Father that all may be one as we are one," that's from John, "opened up vistas closed to human reason, for he implied a certain likeness between the union of the divine persons and the unity of God's sons in truth and charity. This likeness reveals that man, who is the only creature on earth which God willed for itself, cannot fully find himself except through making a sincere gift of himself." Okay, so if you're looking for the meaning of life, it's not 42, it's to make a gift of yourself. All right. What does that mean that, because some people sort of rail at this, what does he mean when he says God willed it, that man is the only creature on earth which God willed for itself? What does that mean? Yes?
Everything else that God willed, that God created, was for the benefit of something else, namely us.
Yeah, so everything, that's the first part. So everything in creation is for us. Right? Everything is a means to my end. But what is John Paul II wanting us to then do? Because there's other objects in the world that... Yes, Kevin?
I think when he says, like, God created for itself, like, man's created for woman created for man, like that.
Yeah. But what are the there's special other objects in the world. Remember we talked about this? Where we can use any objects we want, except for very specific objects, which are called subjects, right? Like I said, so man is the only one who we can't use, right? That has to be treated as an end always, right? Not a means to an end. And we talked a lot about that. And this is the reason why, is because when you use something as a means to something, I determine what it's going to be. Okay? If I use my shoe to nail in as a hammer, I've determined that this shoe is going to be a hammer now. Okay? It's just a means to put the nail in the wood. All right? Not a very good one, but nevertheless. A person, though, I can't do that with, because they get to determine who and what they will be. All right? Yes?
So because, like, humanity, like, man is the only creature that has self-determination, like, that's the case?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. So what John Paul II says is this is what he calls freedom of the gift. And he said, and this is the important part about why I said, like, it isn't just because Adam and Eve are the first two people that Adam goes, well, there's nothing else. Like, he loves the person. All right, he was think about it. This is why it's really important for us to grasp the sort of unfallenness of it. He was under no sort of physical compulsion towards her, because he's different than the animals. That's how he knew it. He's like different. I don't have that like they have it. Right. And remember, his knowledge of the animals is not just what they are, but he knows all about them. Right? He knows that they have this sort of instinct that, you know, the female's in heat, the male goes after it. Right. He doesn't experience that. Right. He sees the person. And in seeing it, his first response is, I want to love her. Okay? Which is a little bit hard for us to imagine, right? And this is why we spend so much time on love and responsibility about when we talked about seeing the sexual value of the person and then remembering it's attached to a person. Okay? And so it's sort of for us to understand then what John Paul II wants us to do is say, okay, well, the solitude isn't just Adam by himself that's overcome by original unity. The solitude is also man and woman together. Okay, because nothing else in this world is going to do that. Okay, it's going to make you realize that you were made to be a gift. Okay. All right, and so this nuptial meaning of the body, indicates a particular capacity of expressing love in which man becomes a gift. On the other hand, the capacity and deep availability for the affirmation of the person corresponds to it. This is literally the capacity of living the fact that the other, the woman for the man and the man for the woman, is by means of the body, someone willed by the Creator for his or her own sake. The person is unique and unrepeatable, someone chosen by eternal love. All right? I will tell you this, the hardest part about living this out is not deciding to make a gift of yourself to someone else. It's receiving them as a gift. Okay? That's what he wants us to understand. All right? Because you can think about like making a gift of yourself all day long, but if you don't think about the other person being a gift to you, you will get hung up on their faults. Okay? And of course, you'll have blind spot to your own faults. Well, look, I'm pouring everything out in this. But the more important part is to see the other person as a gift and to receive the gift. Okay? And that's written into our bodies, right? It's written into our bodies. That not only do we give, but we receive. All right? And then the second part I think we overlook because it doesn't sound near as noble. Right? It doesn't sound like, I just want to make a gift of myself. That is good, and that's what you were made for. But you have to receive the other person, okay, and all their faults and flaws. Right? That's how marriage works. It's to go, well, you know what? This is making a gift of myself doesn't mean I take on a pet project, right, to fix this other person. No, I see them as a gift. I receive them as a gift. And that's where the reciprocity comes from, right? And it also means that this now governs our other relationships, right? That it's beyond just the sort of one flesh relationship of marriage. That this idea of giving, receiving, giving back, right? That's the nature of relationships, right? Like if the relationship isn't like that, what is it? It's not a good relationship, right? Where you're giving and them receiving, they're turning and giving back to you, right? And you can sort of see where he's going with this in just a second. And if you don't, I'm going to give you a visual that I'm really proud of. I can't wait to show you again.
Oh, man.
So John Paul II talks about the marriage being the primordial sacrament. And I want to make sure we understand what this means, because it really just sort of articulates what I just said in much sort of flowier language. So thus, in this dimension, the dimension of the gift, a primordial sacrament is constituted, understood as a sign. Remember, a sacrament is first and foremost. So he's not talking about like the 7 sacraments, all right, initially. Obviously, marriage is one of the 7 sacraments. Understood as a sign that transmits effectively in the visible world the invisible mystery hidden in God from time immemorial. So the invisible mystery hidden in God from time immemorial. Remember that. This is the mystery of truth and love, the mystery of divine life, in which man really participates. In the history of man, original innocence begins this participation, and it is also a source of original happiness. The sacrament, as a visible sign, is constituted with man as a body by means of his visible masculinity and femininity. Okay, this is all stuff we've already said. The body, and it alone, is capable of making visible what is invisible, the spiritual and the divine. It was created to transfer into the visible reality of the world the mystery hidden since time immemorial in God, and thus be a sign of it. All right, so what is he saying there? This is the body, and it alone, is capable of making visible what is invisible. the spiritual and the divine. What does he mean? So the body makes my soul visible, right? Like, so the soul acts in and through the body. So that's the spiritual. What does he mean by the divine? Yes.
Isn't that harken back to the thing where when Adam saw Eve, like he saw like God, and so like that's
The image of God in her. Yep. Yeah. But did he see more than just the image of God, like as in like intellect and will?
It was like, I think there's a prayer that goes like something along the lines of like your spouse is like a physical, material way to like experience the love of God in a sense.
Okay, so we're getting closer. Yeah, that's an important part of it. We're getting closer to sort of where this needs to go. Go ahead.
So like that also like kind of ties into the fact that relationship in marriage kind of mirrors Christ in the relationship with us, like we're right to his groom, that type of thing.
Yeah. So okay. So that's the third thing that he's talking about up above. So just hold that thought. You're right. But how does it make the divine visible? Why is marriage so important to making the divine visible? Go ahead.
Maybe something to do with like procreating in the sense of
Yeah, it has everything to do with that, right?
It's the relationship of the Trinity.
Yeah, it has everything to do with that, right? So then, my proud slide, right? Remember this? Remember this where I gave you this sort of example last week just to show you how God is a sort of a communion person, right? Remember I said God, when he thinks of himself, and he thinks of himself, and because he's perfect, the Word of God is a second person, right? And then the love between them was a third person, okay? What I want to sort of go now is deeper now. So God's knowledge of the Son leads to what? Leads to a third person, right? Man's knowledge of a woman leads to what?
Babies?
A third. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so that's the point, right? Like, why does he call it a primordial sacrament, right? Because it reveals who God is, right? Like, of all the things that get bent and broken during the fall, that's not one of them, right? And we'll talk about why in just a second. But ultimately, like when he talks about, just go back here 1 second, and I want us to be able to see this. It transmits effectively in the visible world the invisible mystery hidden in God from time immemorial. This is the mystery of truth and love, the mystery of divine life in which man really participates. So not only is just God just this sort of abstract, like, oh, really cool, he thinks about himself and he thinks so much of himself and he really loves himself that, wow, it's like that's really kind of cool. No, it's because we're meant to participate in that, right? So God, in doing this, making this physical act of participation in the procreation of children, that's meant to be a sign, the images, the fact that we're going to participate in something else that's pointing to, right? How do we know that? Right? What's the mystery being revealed? And if you think about why didn't this thing get all messed up during the fall? Yes.
Because it's directly related to God, and so that can't get messed up if it's like if it's that relationship in God.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, obviously, the sign could get twisted a little bit, but it's still pointing in the right direction. Yes.
I don't know if this is what you're asking, but previously you mentioned that like marriage heals our brokenness or something. Like
Yeah, because it's a sacrament. It certainly can be a healing because Christ is really present in it, right? Not in the same way as the Eucharist, but yeah.
But so like through that, like again, with Christ being the bridegroom, us being the bride, like was it like necessary to have that in order for us to like recognize our salvation through that?
Yeah, that's exactly it. Like that. So it's exactly why we put crucifixes in the church, right? And we have crucifixes in our home, because that is like That's like the wedding picture, right? Like when people get married, they put a wedding picture in their home. That is when God wedded mankind. And that was when it was consummated, right? What are his last words? It is consummated, right? So from the very get-go, what is God planning?
Or like that marriage.
That, right? Like he's like, I'm going to show you like this participation by I'm going to participate with you, and then you're going to be forever stuck with me. Right? That's love, right? Like you're like thick and thin. Like the vows mean something now. You're like, wow, like a covenant. Like he's actually yoked to us, and he still has his body. Still, there's a human body participating in the life of the Trinity, where we're all going. Right?
The pressure is like real.
Yeah, well, but he's not gonna let you let it go. Like he's literally the hound of heaven, like coming after you, in a non-stalker kind of way. But that's the point. Like that's why marriage is so important, right? Like that's why as Christians we have to defend it, because when it loses that capacity as a sign, when the sign is betrayed, this is what John Paul II talks about, the ethics of the sign. When the sign is betrayed, when contraception is put into it, like it betrays the sign, and it loses its meaning. And then what happens? Well, we see what happens. We lose our direction, right? We lose what Christ did, right? So what does Christ do when they bring up these juridical problems with marriage? He goes, no, let's go back to the beginning, because you're only going to understand your destiny if we go back there. And that's why it's so important, okay? This is the knowledge generation cycle is exactly what I just said, okay? And there's 2 slides here, and I won't go through both of them, but I will say something at the very end, which is really important, and which is really important for us to say. So Adam and Eve don't have children in the account until after the fall. Why? Sometimes I think it's a curse, but maybe. I'm just kidding.
They were given the command beforehand, so they certainly weren't unable to. So I guess
so why are we told after?
It's possible they just fell too quickly, I guess.
Whoops! Well, we meant to do that. Can we? Yes. Yes, go ahead.
Oh, okay. Okay. It depends. I don't know what the circumstances are of actually procreating in, because the Bible recounts it. Like I don't know. I'm not too familiar with that. But maybe it wasn't I don't know. I'm just dishing out a question here. Maybe it wasn't maybe Adam just saw her as an object, and that kind of happened.
So this is the important, which I sort of skipped over the slide. So this idea of knowledge, right? I wouldn't read into it and say, well, Adam now experienced this drive, and he had to do it. So there's a point of the knowledge, because Eve, especially the second time when they talk about, she says, I've created a man with the help of God, right? So she has seen something of the image of God in the whole thing, right? Sarah, what were you going to say?
Something about I don't know. I feel like when you become a parent, you're going to act differently, and I don't know that the fall would have been the same if there were children around.
Okay, well, yeah. So part of the reason, just to make it sort of close this up, the point of them not telling it that way is because if they have children before the fall, then there's a race of unfallen people.
Yeah.
Okay, and we want to make sure we don't grasp that. So that's part of the reason. But why give it this way? And the answer is that God wanted us to know that life is good, right? Life is, even in the midst of all this, Cain kills Abel, right? And what do Adam and Eve do? They have another child. Life is good. Yes.
Or even when God tells Eve, hey, childbirth is going to be awful. Yeah. We still have children.
Yeah. Yeah. And the point is that because a lot of people get really jaded. They're like, why would I bring a child into this world? But what God wants us to know is that life is good. You're making like saints for heaven. What could be better, right? Like God gives you the power to make saints for heaven. Yes, Keith.
This could not relate, but does this have anything to do with like the fruit from being from like the tree of knowledge of good and evil? Like knowledge of like the person, is that like at all?
It distorts it, right? So it distorts. So it's very deliberate that it keeps using the word knowledge, right? Like, so knowledge of good and evil distorts their view of everything, right? Because now evil looks good, good looks so she could think, well, this is dirty and icky. I don't want to do this because now she feels uncomfortable because she has to be naked. Like all these things, right? Like the knowledge of good and evil now makes it so that they can't discern between the two. Evil looks good, has some glamour to it. Good looks hard and maybe evil. Like work you said was good. You told me to tell it, but now it's labor. And like you're saying childbirth is good, but now you're saying it's labor. Like what's the deal, right? And so it has everything to do with that. The fall makes everything twisted around where we don't see things are really good, right? Like creating a saint for heaven is good. It's very good. Okay. All right. So that's all I got. Questions? Yes, Connor.
This might be kind of like super concept, but so we're talking about the Trinity, how the Father loves the Son, the Son loves the Father, that loves the Holy Spirit, and how that is the sign for us is man loves his wife, but now that love comes a new being. Is there a reasoning why it's the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit then instead of the Father and the wife? Or do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah. So, is there a reason? Not that's reality. Like that's just the way it is. Can we make sense of it? Yeah, because goes back to what I said earlier about you would confuse the sign for the thing, right? So if it were a father, mother, child, for example, right? You would go, oh well, then I have to get married, right? Because that's the image of God, I would have to do that. But what it's saying is gift, fruit is really what it's saying to us, right? And so I think it's trying to not help us not confuse sexual imagery for the real thing. Does that make sense? Any other question? Yes.
So in an earlier slide, I think it was from Theology of the Body, JP2 says like the Taoist was that. Was he talking about like the theory of the Pentateuch composition, or was he talking about
he's talking about, so the two accounts, I may have skipped over this, or I may have said, I'm not sure, but the two accounts, they're written at different times, and they use different names for God. The second account is actually written first in time, and they use the name Yahweh, and the first one was written after, and they use the name Elohim, and so they're called the Elohist and the Yahwist account.
So did JP2 reject the Mosaic authorship of Pentateuch?
I don't think he's trying to make a determination one way or the other. I mean,
two accounts are specifically just about creation, right?
Yeah, I mean, he could
Not the
be.
whole.
Yeah, so I don't think that we necessarily have to believe that Moses didn't collect things and then put them together. When we're talking about, I mean, he had to in some respect because he wasn't there, right? So those could have been, accounts that Moses gathered. So I don't think it's trying to say one way or the other. In other words, I think that when the church says that Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible, it's really saying that whatever was there, he collected and put there. And he may have edited it, may not have, but it's sort of like what we do with Isaiah, right? Like we say, Isaiah is the author, but we have reason to think that, given the timing of them, that there's 3 different authors, and this one author came and brought them all back together. Does that make sense?
Well, isn't it also true that, like, I mean, the basics of, like the first account, which was, you know, written second, just laid out, you know, what was already there. You know, the 6 days and the Sabbath. I mean, that was all already there, but that was just describing it then in that way from then on. But it was
and it a little bit makes sense too, just to understand. Like, so, like the second account could have been. It makes sense for Jewish people to want that one specifically because it tells them about themselves. Whereas the first account is almost written like contra the world, right? Because all the other religions of the world saw like the sun is God or the moon is a god. And it starts out, and who made the sun? Our God made that sun and moon. So even if it is a god, our God trumps your God. So it's sort of like that, right? To sort of say, you know, there's only really one creator, no matter what you say. So it can be that too. I don't know that he's trying to sort of come down either way on authorship. I think he's just trying to make it relatable to kind of current biblical scholarship, I think. Other questions?
Who would like to